Hello? Hello? Nice to see everybody here today. It's a nice day outside. I don't know whether to wish for a nice day or a rainy day. So with that in mind, and with the coal ash debacle in mind, I'm going to tell a joke, and then after that, I'm going to say a few words about the Wilma Dykeman legacy, and then after that, I'm going to introduce a woman named Kathy Newfond. My name is Jim Stokely. I'm with the Wilma Dykeman legacy. I want to welcome you to the second of our 5-part series called Water Troubles and Water Solutions, Western North Carolina Water in Context. And think coal ash while I'm telling this joke. There was an actual fellow who lived at the head of Reams Creek, and he was known as a cusser. He just could use curse words like a poet. And he cussed so much and so hard at people that he would reduce grown men to just tears, a puddle of tears. So finally, the community, mainly the women, got together and said, "We don't want you here anymore. We want you to leave our community." Well, on one rainy morning, he packed up everything he had in a wagon, all his household belongings, and started out. And he got down to a big curve down at Hemp Hill, and he tried to take that curve a little too fast, and the wagon fell over, and everything he owned fell out in the mud. And he's sitting there. He got out of the wagon. He was unhurt, standing over his possessions, looked at it, raised himself up. Here's what he said: "Words do not do justice to this situation." So that's what I have to say about coal ash. Anyhow, the Wilma Dykeman Legacy is a tax-exempt public charity. We've been founded in 2012 to sustain and promote Wilma's 3 core values. First core value, environmental integrity. It's part of the reason we're here today. Second value, social justice. So look for future series that have to do with African Americans in Appalachia, particularly Asheville and other subjects. And as long as we're talking about social justice, let's talk about urban versus rural and poor versus rich, as well as race. And finally, the third value, the power of the word, both written and spoken, that flows through everything she stood for and did in her life, and obviously it flows through all of our series and events. The legacy sponsors lectures, programs, other events such as this in the Asheville area. We are a virtual organization. We don't have bricks and mortar. All of our money comes from member contributions. We partner with organizations like RiverLink, like the Osher Lifelong Learning Center at UNCA, like the Buncombe County Public Libraries. We have no paid employees. All of our member contributions go to speaker honoraria, travel expenses. So if you're looking for millionaires, look right over here to Gil Rogers and Kathy Newfond. For all we're paying them, they could just retire today, and also for our printed material, our bookmarks, our brochures that you hold in your hands. Please consider becoming a friend of Wilma Dykeman so that we can continue producing programs. And before you leave, please do 2 things. Complete the speaker evaluation form that you hold in your hands. And if you've not already done so, trade your email address for your lifelong earnings. No, I'm sorry. For a free monthly word from Wilma. Sharon?
Well, you might also mention the Montford Music and Arts Festival, where you're sponsoring a storyteller.
That's correct. This is Sharon Farr, who lives in Montford. She's a driving force behind the Montford Festival. And on May 17th, Saturday, the next Montford Festival, we are sponsoring Joe Penland, he's directly in the Madison County tradition of storytelling and ballads, and he will be performing at the festival, and we'll have a booth there. Now I'd like to say a few words about Kathy Newfont, who will introduce our main speaker, and following Gil Rogers' presentation, Kathy will make some remarks linking Atlanta's water woes maybe with Western North Carolina. Kathy received her PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's currently Associate Professor of History at Mars Hill University. She specializes in U.S. history, where she has broad interests in environmental history, women's history, regional studies, and oral history. And that is, if you put those interests up against Wilma Dykeman's interests, there would be an almost perfect match. Her research centers on the history of southern Appalachian forests and the people they have sustained, and Professor Newfont won the 2012 Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award for her book Blue Ridge Commons, Environmental Activism and Forest History in Western North Carolina. And that book focused on 20th century forest politics in the mountains of Western North Carolina. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kathy Newfont.
Thank you. It's such a delight and a privilege to be with you today. It's a beautiful day, and I know it's really the tried and true folks, the dedicated people who are here today to think about our environment. As Jim said, my interests and Wilma Dykeman's interests bump right up against each other, and so when he called and invited me to be part of this series, I could only think of Wilma and the French Broad and the Tall Woman and all her other wonderful material, and what a privilege it would be to be part of this series. And I'm really thrilled to have Gil Rogers here with us this afternoon. He's going to be talking about one of the most fascinating sets of circumstances around water that there really is in the nation. We don't think of water issues as really being as front and center here in the Southeast as they are out west, but in fact Atlanta stands as a case study of why water issues are really very much with us, just as they are out west. Gil comes to us from the Southern Environmental Law Center, where he is a senior attorney. He's originally from Birmingham, Alabama, and he took off from there, did his undergraduate work at Princeton, and then studied at Harvard Law, and came straight to the Southern Environmental Law Center from law school and has been there ever since. So he's got about 12 years experience there. He's really become an expert on Alabama and Georgia water issues in particular, and this afternoon he's going to focus in, as I said, and as you see here, on Atlanta. So we're going to turn this over to Gil, let him lead us through this case study, and then I'll have a few remarks after that about our own water situation in relation to Atlanta's, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So welcome, Gil, and we'll hand it over to him.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you, Jim, for the opportunity to be here with y'all today. I'm really excited to see everybody here. This is my first time really spending much time up in Asheville, and I've been just delighted with the city so far, the beautiful river. I do work with the Southern Environmental Law Center. Some of you may be familiar with our organization, but for those of you who are not, we are a regional nonprofit law firm that works on environmental issues all over the southeastern U.S. North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and Virginia. We work on water issues and other natural resource issues, transportation, really a little bit of everything that touches environmental issues and quality of life, with an eye towards improving our natural beauty, protecting it for future generations, and making sure that we have wonderful communities like Asheville all over the region as we continue to move forward. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I don't know how well, are we going to turn off the lights or, okay, turn them down? Okay, great. Ideal sleeping lighting. So I need to keep you all awake today. I need to adopt the credo of the guy in Jim's story, and that is my goal is to reduce grown men to tears. So that's what we're gonna shoot for today. So I know a little bit about the issues up here in North Carolina as far as water. I may be one of the only attorneys at the Southern Environmental Law Center right now who is not working on coal ash. It's become quite the hot button issue here in North Carolina and in some of our other states. But my focus has been down in Georgia pretty much since I started with the organization. And I wanted to come to Atlanta for several reasons. One, just a personal reason, being a little bit closer to my hometown of Birmingham. But I've always been aware of Atlanta's issues. And I've only become more so since I've lived there and sort of seen how the policy has been playing out. You see on the left, the traffic, of course, is something that if you've ever been in Atlanta, you've probably experienced some of that. And water is very much like that. I mean, it's a story of broken planning or the absence of planning altogether, and growth that has taken place over the past half century with really no eye towards any kind of realistic natural resource constraints. And so we now have a metro area that is thriving by some measures, but still has a lot of problems that we're only just beginning to come to terms with. So the stories that I'm going to tell about Atlanta's water management, a lot of which transcend Atlanta and affect all of Georgia, I'm hoping those stories will have some bearing on decisions that you all have to make here as you go forward, wrestling with future water supply, with water quality, and with water management. So you'll see throughout this presentation I have sarcastic quotes. So this is the first one. We have not done a great job of managing water in Georgia historically. This is not an exhaustive list, but I just was kind of going through my head. Since I've been in Atlanta in 2002, we've had a few benchmark pieces of legislation at the state level that have tried to start to get around the challenges that we face in Georgia. And you'll understand why Atlanta is so challenging over the next few slides. But I'm going to get into detail on almost all of these. And we will have this presentation available online afterwards. So I know there are a lot of years and wonky language here, so you'll be able to see this on your own time. But Georgia has tried to adopt some statewide management plans starting back in 2004. That was a culmination of a big legislative fight that we had there in 2003 that I'll talk about. The actual state water plan was adopted in 2008, so it's now 6 years old. Since 2008, we've had both a drought and a flood of record in Atlanta, and I can tell you that we've got a very long way to go in terms of the state's response to those natural disasters, and the water plan that we have is not nearly what we need. So on top of that, we had a water conservation law that was passed in 2010 that's actually very good in many ways, that I'm hoping that North Carolina and other states can look to as a model. We have rules governing interbasin transfers, which if you're not familiar with that, that's taking water out of one river basin, using the water, and then discharging it into a different basin. So it's really kind of engineering water amounts that don't belong in river basins. And we have a water supply program under our current governor, Nathan Deal, that is really a reservoir spending spree rather than a true water supply program. I'll talk about that a little bit as well, because I know there are reservoir issues here in North Carolina. And our most recent legislative fight dealt with one of our rivers in Georgia, the Flint River, which I'm going to spend some time talking about as well, because it not only is symbolic of Atlanta's problems, but it gets beyond Atlanta to show all of the challenges that we face in Georgia with managing our water. Jim specifically asked me to touch on water privatization. We've had several run-ins with this issue at a couple of different levels, so I'll just talk about them real quick. Atlanta actually privatized its water utility back in the late 90s. So rather than having a public government entity charged with supplying water to all of a city's residents, Atlanta handed that responsibility over to United Water under a 20-year contract that was executed and that began to operate in 1999. Unfortunately, nothing worked. I mean, whether you're looking at the quality of service, whether you're looking at the rates, whether you're looking at the employees that were charged with implementing the system, it literally all fell apart, and the contract was terminated in early 2003. And depending on what you think about privatization generally, everybody looks at that example and has a takeaway. So people who are still pushing privatization say, well, this just shows you how not to do it. But for me, this really starts to show the dangers of privatizing what ought to be a public resource and a public right that we all have to clean and affordable water. So, amen. There we go. No tears yet. That's good. So there was that privatization effort, and then there was a more a subtle but potentially a more dangerous privatization effort that played out in 2003. I see Julie Mayfield in the audience, and many of you all know Julie. Julie was in Atlanta and can attest to the intensity of that fight. Georgia, like North Carolina, has a legal system that basically acknowledges that water is a public resource. So our rivers and streams don't belong to any one person or one company or one utility. They belong to all of us. And most of the states, if not all of the states east of the Mississippi River, basically have some version of that philosophy about water rights. That we all have a right to reasonable use of the water, but we have to leave enough in the stream for our neighbor. That's kind of a shared philosophy. Many of our states have taken over the role of referee in that system, including Georgia. But in 2003, we started to see some efforts by private interests to change the law in very subtle ways to make water rights in Georgia more private, where people could basically cut deals and put a price tag on our rivers and start to profit from what ought to be a public resource. And this happened again last year, which went into this year. We had a new legislative fight that I'll talk about soon, but the point is that over the period of 10 years, we're still seeing this pressure from many in the interest of the private sector to profit off of public resources like rivers and streams. And I don't mean industry that needs water to run their industrial processes. That's fine, but more fundamentally trying to take away our collective right to enjoying our rivers and streams, making sure there's enough water in them. So Georgia was kind of a ground zero for how this might look in the eastern United States. In the western states, they already have a kind of an absolute property right system connected to their water. But I think that we've seen enough problems with the way the rivers are running out west to know that that is not the answer that we want to start pursuing in the east. So this is a picture of Metro Atlanta. The purple lines there are all counties. I have a handy pointer here, so you can see. You can define the metro area in many different ways, but there are roughly 15 or 16 counties in Metro Atlanta. And you can see based on the map that it's divided out by river basins. And so I don't know how many of you all know the history of Atlanta, but Atlanta was settled as the junction of two railroad lines. It was not settled with any kind of consideration of water in mind. And so it has grown in a way that kind of reflects that, and it's grown in a part of Georgia that is not water rich. So there are 6 different river basins on this map that are part of Metro Atlanta. So you can literally get in your car and drive for 10 minutes and drive across 2 or 3 different river basins. And not only are there that many, but to complicate things further, half of these rivers flow into the Atlantic Ocean and the other half flow into the Gulf of Mexico. So my commute every day from my home to my office, if I poured out a glass of water at home and it flowed in its natural course, it would end up in the Atlantic Ocean. And by the time I get to my office, it would end up in the Gulf of Mexico. So a lot of challenges associated with that. And then finally, these are all, for the most part, these are headwater basins. So that basically means these are the tops of all of these river basins that then flow elsewhere in Georgia. Many of them flow to neighboring states. And so the decisions that are made affecting these headwaters literally flow all the way downstream. So in addition to being just a giant city of 8.5 million people in the metro area, Atlanta has a tremendous impact on water resources solely by virtue of its location. And it shares this with a lot of cities in the Piedmont, including cities like Charlotte in North Carolina. But Atlanta's size kind of makes it unique in terms of the acuteness of this challenge. So people have recognized this over time, and Georgia did pass a law in 2001 that created an overlay district of counties in the metro area to govern water. So this district produces different water plans. The latest update came in 2009, dealing with all aspects of water management. But again, the problem is water doesn't respect political lines. So all of this water is going to leave this district and then be governed by downstream decisions as well. And so it's an imperfect, it's good in the fact that it's getting some governments together who need to be talking, but it's not a comprehensive solution to how we manage water for the benefit of the whole river systems, which is what we care about. This is another illustration of the problem in Atlanta. All the big circles are the major river basins. The Tallapoosa is not on here, but and then all of these arrows are interbasin transfers. Again, taking water out of one river basin and returning it to another. And you can see some of these numbers. These are projected numbers that have changed a little bit over time, but this does illustrate the magnitude of the problem. Some of these are in the hundreds of millions of gallons per day. MGD is million gallons per day. I know this is a beer town, so that's not Miller Genuine Draft. But you can see that there are some tremendous winners and losers here in terms of rivers. And this is really throwing off the natural availability of water, particularly in rivers like the Chattahoochee, which is, if Atlanta has a main river associated with it, it's the Chattahoochee River. And again, this is producing net gains and losses of waters going all the way to the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf. And so, and many of these transfers have been happening for over a century. So the trick is to try to start fixing the system, reversing some of these engineering that have occurred over decades, which is not an easy issue in Georgia. So one of the goals that the Southern Environmental Law Center and some of our partners in Atlanta in terms of water management is to look at these proposed interbasin transfers and basically do an environmental cost and benefit checklist before you let these things happen again. Sort of a common sense, who wins, who loses, what are the environmental impacts. We did get a rulemaking that happened at the state level in 2011 dealing with water withdrawal permits that involved interbasin transfers. But the problem is, legally, it is not binding. So it said, the law literally says this is the list that should be considered. So it's more of a guidance than an actual rule. But the 22 factors are a good lesson in terms of the different things that need to be considered when you're looking at interbasin transfers. And issues like interbasin transfers, I should say, water in Georgia is very, I wouldn't say it's nonpartisan, but it is, it's very interesting, the political dynamics that exist around water. It's not a Republican versus Democrat issue when it comes to making good decisions about water. It's much more of an upstream versus downstream issue. So downstream Republicans are often the ones that are most, even though they're associated with very anti-environmental decisions at the DC level, at the state level, if you're downstream, they are very much advocating for things like this as opposed to upstream legislators. So it's an interesting breakdown. Another issue we deal with in Atlanta that I know y'all deal with in parts of North Carolina are reservoirs. This map is a little bit dated at this point, but it really hasn't changed in terms of all of the different reservoirs that are on somebody's radar screen. All of those dots represent either recently built reservoirs or proposed reservoirs around Atlanta. You can see they make a kind of a ring shape around the metro area. Not all of these are going to be built. I would say potentially not even half of these are going to be built, but this to me is another symptom of Atlanta and Georgia's lack of willingness to really embrace this problem and come up with a plan that answers basic questions like how much water do we really need, how much water do we have, and how are we going to make up the difference. These reservoirs are extremely expensive, even if you don't care about the environmental impacts of further dams on our rivers and streams. They're extremely expensive as compared to water management options like water conservation and water efficiency. So we argue both the cost reasons and the environmental related reasons for discouraging reservoir options and encouraging things like water conservation and water efficiency first. So another sarcastic quote headline here, and again, I alluded to this earlier, but our governor has basically taken a position that water supply to him and to his administration means more reservoirs. So he launched a program in 2011 that is called the Water Supply Program, but in reality, the money that has been doled out to local governments has gone almost entirely to reservoir projects. The other problem with it is it's not that there's not enough money because these projects are so expensive. This has not actually resulted in one single project getting built that wouldn't have otherwise been built. So it's become kind of, depending on how cynical you want to be, it's become a kind of a return favor for political support more than anything else. We've made the case time after time after time from a legal standpoint that Georgia is absolutely capable of funding water conservation projects the same way, but that has just not been an interest in the leadership that we have currently, unfortunately. So now let's talk about all the crazy ideas Atlanta has had because of this lack of planning for growing. And I know even up in North Carolina, there are people who are nervous that at some point Atlanta is going to extend some feelers up this way. The most kind of the flashiest proposal that I've seen is this proposal to take water out of the Tennessee River and pipe it to Atlanta, and that may or may not involve moving the border of Georgia and Tennessee, which Tennessee is thrilled about, by the way. So, like, sounds great to us. I don't, it doesn't seem to be a very politically supportable position. But this article headline was from 2008. This is another article that came out last year. So you can see that this issue doesn't really go away. It's still, in fact, last year, Georgia's General Assembly passed a resolution ordering our state's Attorney General to sue Tennessee this year if Tennessee did not capitulate to this demand of taking water out of the river. And as far as I know, Tennessee has not capitulated, so we're kind of playing a weird game of chicken now with whether the Attorney General is actually going to file suit. I sincerely doubt that's going to happen. There are all kinds of separation of powers issues, but the point is, this is still an idea in the minds of some about how we can get water to Atlanta, rather than focusing on, how has Atlanta been growing? Is that sustainable? How can we change this whole paradigm? One of the other rivers that I've focused on a lot in the last couple of years is the Flint River. I'll show you a map in just a minute so you can visualize it, but it is a great example of a river that lies entirely within Georgia and really encapsulates the challenges that we have in managing our water well. This is a report, by the way, that American Rivers put out. They're a big partner of ours in Georgia. I know they work nationwide, but they're very focused on low flows in rivers and reservoir issues. So on the left is a map of all of the rivers in Georgia. Just to give you a sense, Metro Atlanta is right here, so you can see all the rivers that are flowing out of it. But the Flint is here. And if any of y'all have ever flown into or out of the Atlanta airport sits on top of the headwaters of the Flint River. So right off the bat, you can see that we've kind of turned our back on the river a little bit. But it flows about 250 miles south. It ends right down here in Lake Seminole. And this is an illustration of the actual Flint Basin. So all of this upper part of the basin is in Metro Atlanta, so you have a lot of challenges dealing with just general development, paving over our streams and headwaters. As you move downward in the basin, this is getting into serious agriculture country. Georgia launched an irrigation initiative in the 1970s, and you can see, I'll show you some visualizations of that. But that's had some severe impacts on the Flint River. So this is a picture of one of the dry creeks. This is actually can be a very significant stream when it's got water in it. The Flint River has been hammered by drought. There have been 3 droughts of record just in the last 15 years. But even outside of a drought, the Flint River and its tributaries are showing declines in stream flow measured year after year after year. So we have everything from endangered species problems to recreational challenges to plain old water supply challenges in the Flint Basin. So all of these dots are agricultural water withdrawal permits. Georgia started regulating water withdrawals in the 1970s. Both surface water and groundwater, and all of these are individual permits, and there are thousands of them. And the Flint Basin, again, is this basin right here. One of the challenges on the Flint is that it's very connected to the groundwater table. So even if you have a groundwater withdrawal permit, it ends up impacting surface water flows in the Flint as well. So this is a sort of a visualization of what that looks like. These are minimum flow readings dating back to the 1940s. And you can see that there's some scatter there, of course, because of rainfall, but on average, the flow is down in a statistically significant way post-irrigation. This is just another creek that shows that a little more sharply. So there was a piece of legislation in Georgia that was passed in 2000 trying to capture these problems on the Flint specifically, but it was unworkable from the start. So I like to talk about this law because it gives a lot of lessons in what not to do. So it's the name of the bill is the Flint River Drought Protection Act. It involves making a pronouncement about whether Georgia is in or out of a drought by March 1st of every year, which itself is just not workable. And originally it was set up to basically pay farmers not to irrigate. That was the whole idea. So to keep water in the river, there was a bank set up where farmers could elect to forego planting and irrigating and take money out of this bank. It never worked the way it was designed to, both in terms of the fact there was almost never any money to put into the bank, but it also never resulted in any measurable improvements in the river itself. So a lot of problems were recognized with this, and then last year, this is where we had our second fight about water privatization. There were some improvements made to the act. There wasn't the magic drought declaration anymore. There were some irrigation efficiencies that were required, which are good, which our farmers in Georgia have already been making quite a bit of progress towards. There were some studies mandated of the Flint River, which is important. The problem that we really ran into from an environmental standpoint and from a legal standpoint is that this bill authorized something called a flow augmentation project. And what it meant was, it was so undefined that it essentially would have allowed a private company to put water into a tributary of the Flint River and then say that water is off limits to everybody downstream. So that immediately cuts into our philosophy of water belongs to all of us. We all have a right to a reasonable use of it. This bill would have allowed a private entity potentially to say, that's not your water, I'm controlling the water, I'm cutting off your tap, which starts to look a lot like Western water law and starts to get into some serious problems with our riparian rights system. So we had a fight last year. We prevented the bill from coming up for a vote. We had a fight this year during our entire legislative session, which ended about 3 weeks ago. And we finally succeeded in getting the bill into a form that was not nearly as legally dubious and ambiguous. But the problems in the Flint, again, are the Flint has been over-permitted. It's been over-allocated. There's too much water that has been allowed to be taken out, and we need to do something about that. Now, that's not easy to do. That's very politically challenging, but otherwise you're stuck with these imperfect fixes. These are some of the goals that we laid out for focusing on the river as a whole, focusing on all of the water uses, requiring target stream flows. And when we talk about stream flows, we don't just want to talk about how much water do we need to let everybody take some out. We want to talk about how much water will keep this stream healthy.
Yeah.
Yes?
Can you explain that better? What's happening?
That is, so Georgia actually has some stream augmentation projects that are already happening. And that was another argument that we made, is legally you didn't need to change the law to let this happen. There are some creeks in the lower Flint River that have endangered mussel species in the creeks. And so the state Department of Natural Resources is already doing projects like what you see here, which are flow augmentation projects. This is basically taking groundwater and then releasing it into a stream so that it flows down and keeps these mussels alive. But you can see that it's just basically an elaborate life support system. It's not getting to the core problems of why do we need this in the first place. But the law that ended up passing this year essentially lets this specific kind of project happen to protect endangered species, which, by the way, is also required under our federal laws. The Endangered Species Act already mandates fixes like this, although this is not the best way to go about doing it. It's not going to get to the long-term cause of the problem. So this is another vision of rivers in Georgia. This, again, is the Flint River, just to give you some perspective. This is the Chattahoochee River flowing through Atlanta, and then both of these rivers merge at the Florida state line to form the Apalachicola River. And some of the best oysters in the country are down here. If you've never been, I highly encourage you to go. They're delicious. And they're also, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry for Florida. So there's a lot that rides on having enough water flowing through this system to keep this estuary functioning biologically. But you can see here again is Metro Atlanta. So there are rivers that start in this metro area that also flow into Alabama. The Chattahoochee obviously flows into Florida and also forms the border with Alabama. And so decisions that are made about how to manage water in Atlanta affect all kinds of interests downstream, whether you're in Montgomery or whether you're in Mobile Bay in Alabama, or even in Rome, Georgia, or Columbus, Georgia, which are, you know, downstream from Atlanta. There's a lot of tension that exists about making sure that the water that's in those systems is clean and abundant. So those river systems have resulted in a lot of lawsuits over the past 30 years, or 25 years rather, but the latest round started in 1990. The other complicating issue with those rivers is that these big lakes are controlled by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. And so you have this federal agency that's in charge of sending water through its dams. You have states that are all using water and have different competing interests. So it's a tremendous challenge by any account to get this right. So there have been lawsuits because these states have a very hard time talking to one another. And everybody's been involved. Our organization has been involved at some level. All the states have been involved. The Corps of Engineers has been involved. Occasionally you'll see things like the city of Columbus, Georgia will file its own legal arguments that might or might not line up with the state of Georgia as a whole. So it's a huge mess. And sort of sitting at the heart of that mess is the Corps of Engineers and how much water it is releasing out of the dams. So the first big round of lawsuits dealt with the question of Lake Lanier, which is on the Chattahoochee River above Atlanta. We passed it when we drove up here yesterday. And the question was whether Lake Lanier could be used by Atlanta for water supply without getting further permission from Congress. The first answer to that question was no. That happened in 2009. 2 years later, a different court looked at the exact same pile of documents and said, yes, of course it can be used for water supply. The Supreme Court declined to hear a challenge to that in 2012. And so the answer to that specific legal question is yes, Georgia can use some water in Lake Lanier for Metro Atlanta water supply, leaving aside the more difficult questions of how much water and what about everybody else that needs water for hydropower, what about the navigation interests, what about the city of Columbus downstream. And so you have all of these competing interests that continue to have tension with one another. So we went about a year without having any lawsuit in play, and then Florida got bored and decided that they were going to sue us again in the U.S. Supreme Court. Our Constitution allows for states to sue each other directly, to go straight to the Supreme Court to basically allocate water between states. Most of these lawsuits over time have happened out west. But actually, North Carolina and South Carolina had one for a few years that y'all may have read something about over a proposed interbasin transfer between the Catawba Basin and the Yadkin Basin. That lawsuit ended up settling, so it never went forward. But at this point, we are waiting to see whether the Supreme Court is going to agree to hear this case. But the basic question has always remained the same. Again, how much water does each state really need? What is each state doing to manage its own house? And how can you allocate water in such a way that each state gets enough for its uses both now and in the future? And it's that future use that's the reason that these states can't agree, because there's no politician that is going to say, yes, I cede my future water rights to my neighboring state. It just doesn't work that way. And their terms are not of a sufficient length their terms are short enough in the grand scheme of things where they basically don't have to make that decision. They can kind of kick the can down the road, and that's what we keep seeing. We have all three of the states that I showed on that map earlier, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, all of them have Republican governors right now, but nobody can agree. Nobody can even come to the table, really. There have been attempts to do that over time, but we're not seeing a whole lot of progress there. Our preferred solution is let's get all of the water interests into a room, including the environmental interests, the industries, the agriculture, the municipal interests, and let's hash out some kind of adaptive formula that we can all agree on going forward. I don't think there's any other way to solve this. Even if a judge makes a pronouncement about how much water each state deserves, that's not going to be the last word. One of the reasons Florida filed this particular complaint is the Apalachicola Bay collapsed last year. There were a lot of reasons for this. The oyster populations are slowly recovering, but they've really taken a hit. There is a freshwater problem coming from upstream. There's not enough water getting to the estuary, but there's also a separate saltwater problem with more saline water coming in from the Gulf of Mexico, and that's just really thrown off the whole ecosystem. But Florida is claiming that Georgia is using too much water, and basically that means Metro Atlanta is using too much water, and wants the Supreme Court to agree with Florida and say that Georgia needs to send more water downstream. So we had a pretty active legislative session this year in Georgia, and the biggest, the piece of legislation that we were following the most closely was the Flint River bill. The Corps of Engineers is updating its protocol for operating its dams on the ACT is an acronym that stands for Alabama, Coosa, Tallapoosa River. That's the system that is shared between Georgia and Alabama. The ACF is the Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint system. That's shared by all three states. We still have this question about how much water Lake Lanier can give over to water supply. What does that mean for Metro Atlanta growth? What's going to happen with this crazy Tennessee River proposal? We've made some strides in Metro Atlanta and in Georgia generally on conservation. I mentioned that 2010 bill. I would highly encourage folks in North Carolina who are following this to look at that. It's a great model. It covers a lot of different water conservation issues. All of our states in our region have aging infrastructure. So one of the easy ways to think about conserving water is just updating your pipes. Eliminating leaks. Systems are losing 25-30% of water in some cases that they take out of a river before it gets to your tap. And that's water that's already been treated, so you're losing money on energy and on water. So there were audits that were done on public water utilities under this 2010 conservation law. There was requirements for outdoor watering restrictions. There were requirements for water efficient fixtures in both industry and home construction. So it had a lot of good pieces to it. But we continue to see this overemphasis at the governor level on water supply means reservoirs, and that's just not that's not the right way to look at the whole suite of options. So just to provide a couple of takeaways for y'all, and I think Kathy can get into some of this, and I'll be happy to answer questions as well. But one of the problems we have in the South as a region is that many of our cities have not grown in proportion to whatever water supply is available to them. Most of the cities in the Piedmont fall into this category, but elsewhere as well. You don't have a large river available or a groundwater source available to sustain the growth. And so people are having to get very creative and often having to get very engineered in order to keep up with population growth. We need to stop that pattern. We need to change the way that we grow, that we think about growing. We're not saying we need to stop growing, but there are ways to do it that are much more compatible with natural water constraints. I didn't talk as much about energy, the connection with energy. If you're following the coal ash problem, you're seeing a lot of that play out here in North Carolina in a very big way. But even apart from that, looking at the amount of water that we need to produce electricity by different means is very important. So we need a comprehensive plan that really takes all of these questions very seriously, that's objective about looking at different ways to manage water, and that makes the link between things like surface and groundwater, between water quantity and water quality. When we passed the Clean Water Act in the 1970s, that was a great moment in environmental protection history, but the Clean Water Act doesn't look at groundwater at all, and it really doesn't look at stream flow at all. And so it's an imperfect and incomplete look at the puzzle, and we're seeing how some of those problems are now playing out now. So we've got our work cut out for us, but it's certainly doable. Having a local government that's very engaged in water management and good water sustainability is is very important. Having a lot of buy-in from people like y'all, having public meetings and transparent decision-making is very important. You know, I don't think Atlanta is going to fall into the sea or anything anytime soon, but we've got to really get serious about our water management so that we keep these river systems healthy going all the way to the ocean. So with that, I'll wrap up, and I have my contact information there. I'll leave that up if y'all want to chat more about this or email about this, and also have our organizational website there. There's a lot of good information on it about water. We look at everything from water quality to drought protection, and water planning. So thank you all very much again for your attention on this Saturday afternoon in this semi-darkness. I hope people are awake. And I'll hand it to Kathy.
Thank you so much, Gil. Okay, so, wow, that is a lot to take in. And I am a historian, as Jim said, and I think in historical terms. So I'm better equipped to talk about the resonance I see with in broad terms than I am to talk about some of the very contemporary issues. Julie had to leave for another meeting. She would have been a wonderful resource to talk about contemporary issues. She's with the Western North Carolina Alliance, which is a magnificent regional group that we have to work on some of these issues. So I'm going to talk in broad terms here about what Gil's presentation has me thinking about in terms of our region. And I'm going to start with the idea of the commons. This idea of Blue Ridge Commons is the name of my book, and the idea of the commons came to me through oral history interviews that I did with environmental activists. And I was looking at forest history, so I was looking at the forest as a commons. And a commons is just exactly what Gil was describing here. It's a situation in which resources that are very valuable are not privately held. There's no single entity, individual, or group that can claim the resources exclusively. And we're not used to thinking in terms of commons in the United States because we have this emphasis on private property. But as a historian, one of the points that I argue is that actually we have a very long and deep history of commons in the United States. We just don't know it because we haven't used the term and we haven't really thought systematically about commons. But what Gil's describing in terms of water and air are kind of the ultimate commons. They're things that we all need. They're very valuable. We can't get along without them. We must use them. There are lots of different ways that we use them, lots of different entities that need them, and we tend to get in competition and conflict for the way they should be managed. The important point I think that I want to make here that comes to me from Gil's presentation is how absolutely critical the question of commons governance is. Common systems are just that. They are systems. And they're every bit as complicated as private property systems. Okay? We have whole teams of lawyers that are doing property law all the time that are only looking at private property. And we thankfully have wonderful lawyers like Gil and others at the Southern Environmental Law Center and in other partner groups who are also really wrestling with the questions of governing the commons. It's difficult to govern commons, and we're kind of on the front end of really understanding how effective commons governance works. For those of you who are interested in this, a few years ago, Elinor Ostrom, the great economics thinker, won the Nobel Prize in economics for her work on commons governance. So she's kind of the place to start. She's sort of, if you're interested in commons governance, Elinor Ostrom's work on commons governance is the place to begin. But commons governance, as Gil's presentation makes abundantly clear, it is difficult. You get competing and conflicting user groups. It's difficult. He talked about how the Flint River is over-allocated, right? There's too much harvesting from a limited resource in the case of the Flint River. That's the kind of classic tragedy of the commons. That's where too many people are harvesting too much from a limited resource. Once it happens, how do you dial it back? Right, which is exactly the issue that the Southern Environmental Law Center and its allies and partners are working on trying to address, specifically in the Flint River case. It's also important, some of what he talked about is the competing and conflicting uses, right? You have metropolitan Atlanta, which has needs for water. Downstream, you have these enormous agricultural needs for water, and then if you go downstream farther than that into Florida, where you have this industry that's reliant on oysters there. And so those are just three. I'm sure there are others. Those are probably the big three, but there probably are other competing uses as well. Recreational uses, for instance. People probably, in this area that's huge, right? People want to be able to raft, they want to be able to kayak and so on. And I expect in Georgia, they're fishing, there's some other uses that people would like to do. They're probably not as big money as those three, but they're also important. And then of course there are also the importance of the environmental services that we require from our water sources. And those, sometimes we have a hard time putting a monetary value on that. In recent years, past couple of decades, we've made a lot of progress toward trying to put monetary values, at least recognize that there are monetary values to the environmental services that are provided by forests and rivers and soil and so on. I come away with this emphasis on commons governance, how very difficult it is. I'm also struck by, in Gil's presentation, how commons governance, which would be difficult in any case, and this came up in our very first phone call when we were talking about this, it becomes even more difficult because political lines don't match up with environmental lines. Okay? And that makes what would already be an extraordinarily difficult problem to manage even more difficult, kind of astonishingly more difficult. And I'm reminded of the case in Western North Carolina of the Canton plant, which for many, many decades was a wonderful boon to the Western North Carolina economy, but then released its polluted waters to flow across the downstream into Tennessee. Poor Tennessee is taking a beating this afternoon, right? Georgia wants its water. North Carolina's been polluting its water. I mean, we're all beating up on Tennessee, bless their hearts. But anyway, so and that problem for that was a 100-year problem that only recently has had some has been addressed in some ways that are at least more effective than what we were doing before. And I wouldn't say that it's over as a problem, but it's been at least mitigated a little bit. But it was made extraordinarily difficult by the fact that the people who were downstream, it gets to the upstream downstream issues too that Gil was talking about. The people who were downstream from the Canton plant were getting all of they were taking all the hits from the pollution without getting any of the economic benefits from the plant. North Carolina was in the opposite position, getting all the economic benefits from the plant without taking really hardly any of the environmental hit that was coming downstream. And so that was and it became very difficult to address the problem because it was a problem that was going across state lines. So I think that's and here in the Appalachians, this problem of political boundaries not matching up with environmental boundaries is kind of a fact of life in the region ever since there have been political boundaries in the region. We are a region that is chopped up into 8 different states, and so just in the Southern Appalachians, I'm not even talking about the whole chain, just the Southern Appalachians. So that makes these kinds of issues in this area even more difficult. Then Gil was also talking about reservoirs and the kind of thinking that water supply issues means water reservoirs and building more reservoirs. And I'm struck, of course, the situation with the Asheville Reservoir is one of the big ones that we are wrestling with right now, very up in the air, what's going to happen. The state legislature has moved to remove control of the Asheville Reservoir from the city itself to the Metropolitan Sewerage District, which treats wastewater as a public utility also, and has a good history doing a good job with our wastewater, but has not been in the business of reservoir management up to this point. There's a lawsuit in the courts right now about whether or not the legislature can do that, simply remove the reservoir. But that's the latest and a very big, important issue in terms of the Asheville Reservoir, but it is not by any means the first time that reservoir has been controversial. There's a 100-year history there too of controversy over that reservoir. And this resonates with Gil's point about how our population centers are not right by our water supply. That reservoir that serves Asheville's in the North Fork Valley over near Black Mountain. It's not right, it's not right down Patton Avenue. And so that's been 100 years ago when the city first started needing to address its water problems. And of course we have the French Broad here, so we're not quite in the same situation that Atlanta is, where there was a railroad crossing but no natural river there. Asheville was founded along the French Broad on purpose because of the river. So that's a different history. Nonetheless, the need for water to serve the city took the city 100 years ago looking elsewhere for a water source and looked at the North Fork Valley. The city condemned the land, which is of course not in Asheville, but condemned the land in the 1920s and was in that sense sort of forward thinking because knew it was going to need the water. But the rural people of that area are the ones that bore the brunt of the land was condemned, they were removed from their homes. There's a lot of resentment to this day in the North Fork Valley area over those removals. And then when the land was flooded in the 1950s, Asheville, again, this gets at the complexity, wanting to be sure that it had a good clean water supply, really wanted to control the entire valley, the headwaters of that reservoir, so that it could promise clear water. And of course Asheville has for roughly 200 years now has been a tourist town, and so it's important that you draw and renowned as a health center, so the cleanliness of the water, the purity of the water has been very important to the economy of the city for well over a century. And so it wanted to assure the clean water, but as a result what it did was really protect that entire watershed area to the point that people whose homes had been there, whose farms had been there, could not go back. They were not allowed to walk back there to their old hunting grounds, were not allowed. And I did some interviews around this issue years ago when I was in graduate school, and it was still very much in the forefront. And the city in the 1980s started a lumber harvesting project on the reservoir there, and where local people just got outraged. And this was a precursor to the Western North Carolina Alliance's very successful Cut the Clear Cutting campaign that really changed policy on the national forest. But the Citizens Against Clear Cutting in the Asheville Watershed in the Black Mountain area, CACAW was the name of the group, and they raised a ruckus because there was this huge lumber harvesting equipment allowed in the watershed when these folks weren't allowed to go in there and shoot a rabbit. And they're like, which one of these is more damaging, likely, to the clarity of the water? So that was a huge issue, and now with this potential transfer of the reservoir from the city of Asheville to the Metropolitan Sewerage District, there's a lot of concern about, what is that going to mean? How will the water be managed? And these gets again the issues that that Gil raised. Will it be managed for water supply? Will it be managed for water quality? Will there be a conservation component to the management? It's very much a question mark, since if it is to be transferred, depending on the outcome of this court case, to the Metropolitan Sewerage District, we don't have there's no track record that entity has for managing reservoirs. We don't know what the emphasis might be. We do know there would be more rural participation in the management of that group than currently is the case with it under the management of the city of Asheville. There's also been talks about building other reservoirs. Eventually Asheville's going to outgrow the capacity of that reservoir. There's already been discussion about that. I live out in the Barnardsville area of the county, and every now and then people will talk about, there've been these plans that'll circulate around, kind of like what Gil talked about, the plan to pipe out of Tennessee. My neighbors occasionally hear rumors of plans to dam the Ivy River and for another reservoir for Asheville, and you can imagine how excited they are about that prospect. Not happy at all about that. And so I want to leave some time for Q&A here. I don't want to go too long, but I am struck with these resonances, and I want to end on the upstream downstream issues that Gil raised, and really talk about how much resonance there is in our area with those issues as well. And of course, we've mentioned coal ash. That's an enormous one in our area as well. Asheville is downstream in terms of the Duke Power Plant out by Lake Julian, and our coal ash storage systems are not reliable, as has been abundantly demonstrated to everyone's horror recently. And so we know that there's groundwater contamination there. We know there's surface water contamination. We know Duke Power's own numbers suggest that about 1 million gallons a day are leaching from of water are leaching from that plant, and potentially doing all kinds of damage. And then of course there's the issue, if the pond were to actually fail, if the dams there were to fail, then there's all kinds of horrible downstream issues that would affect, of course, the French Broad River, potentially flow across I-26, and there would be likely loss of life if that were to happen. And then of course the damage to Asheville's water recreation economy alone would be stunning, and that doesn't even get into all the other issues of human health and environmental health that would also result. And then we're also struggling a lot with questions of stormwater runoff. We have a lot of bacteria and sediment from farms and from construction. A lot of it comes from construction. Sediment, the number one pollutant in the streams in this area. And that's an ongoing problem. Bacteria as well. So those are my thoughts after hearing Gil and thinking about our own water issues. If you're interested in these things, I would like to give a shout out to both to Julie Mayfield and to Hartwell Carson. Hartwell is the French Broad River keeper with the Western North Carolina Alliance, and I called both Julie and Hartwell after I talked to Gil. I was like, okay, I can do the history, but you need to talk to me about the current issues. And Hartwell has really an hour-long presentation about the French Broad water issues that are in front of us. If you get a chance to hear that, he's really the expert, and I would highly recommend that. The Western North Carolina Alliance website also has a lot of information about these issues: the coal ash issue, sedimentation in the streams, French Broad River keeper information. There's a lot of wonderful material there, so I encourage you to take a look at that if you want to know more. All right, and now you've sat long enough listening, so let's take a few minutes for questions for Gil and me both. Yes?
Question for Gil. With regard to agricultural water in Georgia, number one, do the farmers pay for it, and has it been more costly since the water is more scarce?
Okay.
Maybe you want to repeat the question so everyone can hear.
You guys hear through this?
Yeah.
Okay. go to Sally Jesse Raphael style. The question was, do the farmers in Georgia pay for the water that they withdraw? And the answer to that really is no. So that answers your second question, which was, does the price change depending on the use of the system? So there may be a nominal fee for just getting a permit, but our water withdrawal laws in Georgia were written with these blanket exemptions for agricultural use. And to be fair, I mean, agricultural use does differ a little bit from industry and from municipal water use. It's very, you have to, agricultural investments are much longer term, deciding what you're going to plant, and then having a water regime that allows that to happen. I mean, that's a months to years long investment. A lot of money goes in. So there is some, I personally can understand treating that a little bit differently, but when these laws were enacted back in the 1970s, there was no real effort to have any kind of control over that. So the state has very little ability from a legal standpoint to regulate agricultural water use. And as you saw in some of those slides, the result has just been this proliferation of irrigation wells, particularly in South Georgia, that are having these real detrimental effects on rivers and on aquifers that are affecting everybody now. So our fear is, the Southern Environmental Law Center, we work in all branches of government. Everybody hears lawyers and they hear, oh, lawsuits, you guys just sue people. We do go to court when we have to. It's kind of a last resort. We try to work things out in forums that are more, less adversarial. But my fear is that the situation in Georgia has gotten to the point where you're going to start seeing Farmer A sue Farmer B because there's just not enough water in the system to sustain all of that. And I think it's a preventable problem. I think it's not an easy problem, but you've got to have the political will to start to face it. And I do think getting to one of the points behind your question, I think, is, and Kathy also alluded to it, I don't think we price water right in Georgia or really anywhere else. And I don't mean, again, I don't believe that water is private property in its kind of basic sense, but I'm talking about the full cost of treating the water, of keeping enough in the system. We just don't pay the value of all of that and all of the other services that water provides. And I think we need to obviously keep in mind water is also a basic human right, so we don't want to price it in a way that prevents people from using it that need it, but we're not managing it, we're not respecting it in a way that is keeping our systems healthy. So that's got to change. I definitely think, at least in Georgia, one of the changes has got to be how we're treating the agricultural sector, how they're treating the system, and we just got to move off of the status quo.
Could you elaborate on that? Conservation clearly can play a role, and you alluded to that. But also, bulk users were getting discounts, right. So there's a disincentive there.
Right. So a piece of that is, and water conservation, again, water conservation is a huge term. A lot of people think, oh, it means low flow toilets. And that's one thing that it does mean. It means turning off the water when you brush your teeth and stuff like that. But it can mean all kinds of things, from whole industry-wide changes in fixtures to becoming more efficient to fixing your leaking infrastructure. So I use conservation in a very broad way, but one of the ways that we can serve is pricing water better to reflect the actual use. And one of the problems that we've seen in Georgia, and it sounds like y'all have it here, is historically the pricing was inverted, where if you use more water, you actually pay less for it. So it was encouraging waste, really. It was encouraging high volumes of water use in order to get a better rate on your bill. And absolutely, one of the first things we need to do is right-size that. And so that if you do use more water, you have to pay more for that extra usage. And there are different ways of setting rates that actually do that. One of the challenges there is you really have to make those tiers you know, affect your pocketbook. I mean, just this sort of nominal change is not going to work. I mean, you've got but there are ways. There's actually, I believe North Carolina State has a center on water economics where they're looking at that issue, ways to get that right. One of the challenges that all of the water utilities face here in Georgia is, and this again gets back to reservoirs, is they're so expensive that utilities in Georgia are still paying off debt to finance reservoirs they built decades ago. And so from the utility standpoint, they need people to use water and pay for that water to keep the utility solvent. So it's a real problem because none of those utilities have any incentive to encourage conservation because that affects their bottom line. So I'm not here to give you the answer. If I had the answer, I probably would win a Nobel Prize myself. That would be delightful. Yes.
Well, I look at things a little bit differently. I think that a lot of the problem is the stormwater sewers because they move the water away as fast as it hits the ground, and particularly in areas that are covered with pavement and that sort of thing. So I know out west they have done a lot about rainwater management, basically keeping it on site with really simple landscaping approaches, and they've encouraged that at the individual residential level by using incentives. I want to know if this approach has any traction at all in Atlanta. Things like looking at where the recharge zone is for the aquifers, and then they could pay individual landowners to do berms and swales and recharge the aquifer, which really has an impact on the river, the height of the river.
Right. We have good acoustics in here, so that came through very clearly for me. And it's funny you mentioned that. Actually, I had to be choosy in keeping my talk within its time constraints. So I really didn't talk very much today about stormwater and the more water quality side of the problem, but it's equally acute. And it's funny you mentioned that because I actually ate breakfast today at the Sunny Point Cafe, which was delightful and which has a pervious parking lot. And exactly the kind of example that you were alluding to. We haven't gotten to the point in Atlanta where we are mandating that kind of feature in our developments, and I honestly don't even know how much we're encouraging it. I know that more and more people are doing it just because it really makes sense no matter which way you look at it. Again, if you're not an environmentalist, a lot of it makes sense from just a sheer cost perspective. And it's one of those longer term investments that really starts to pay off over time. But that's something we've got to do more and more of. One of the differences in Atlanta is we really don't have a groundwater. We don't have much groundwater at all. So we don't have, there are a few people that have wells, but that's really, almost all of our water supply is surface water. And that also, the geology also affects our stormwater. So it really impacts our rivers more than our aquifers in that part of Georgia.
I just wanted to comment that, with every inch of rain on an acre of land is over 27,000 gallons of
Right.
water. And, if we don't invite it to stay and to go into the ground and keep the soils moist and the plants healthy, and we just send it away, then of course we have droughts.
Yeah, this is I feel like I should say something here too, because if Hartwell were here, he would definitely agree with that and talk about that. He has, in his PowerPoint that he shared with me, he has a whole section about that. And I know the Western North Carolina Alliance has worked with homeowners and schools and businesses to do just exactly the sort of work that you're describing. And that stormwater runoff is a big problem, and these are simple ways to address that.
It's one of the things we do a lot in partner with Western North Carolina Alliance and other groups. But that is, part of it's just a shift in thinking. Like 30 years ago, the thinking was that's the goal, is to get the water off your property as fast as possible, and that was a good thing as that was perceived. But that's why our rivers turn orange now after any kind of rainstorm. And so I think certainly on the engineering side and the education side, people are understanding that's not the way to do it. We're trying to find ways to get governments and utilities to really incentivize those fixes, through a variety of different ways.
We have time for just a couple more questions.
You referenced some of the privatization efforts that happened in Atlanta, but we didn't really delve into the problems that came about from that. Can you give us like 2 or 3 real quick lessons learned from that? We might want to think
Sure, and I encourage you. It's an interesting story, and I know several large cities have experimented with that with varying results. Atlanta is just kind of the poster child. From my perspective, the problem, and this is a little bit cynical, but the real problem is that you're allowing a corporation that is beholden to its shareholders and its bottom line to make decisions about managing a resource that really is a public resource. So there's kind of a disconnect from the get-go about those different competing goals. I don't know whether that was the cause of the breakdown in Atlanta, but I know that particular water utility at that particular time did a terrible job of just managing the resource. And there were some accusations that Atlanta's infrastructure, and the other thing I haven't said is Atlanta's infrastructure on both the water and sewer side is ancient. And there's a big Clean Water Act lawsuit back in the 90s on the sewer side to force Atlanta to clean up its system. It's spent billions of dollars to do that. There are a lot of improvements in water quality that we've seen. So that's all been good. But in terms of this privatization effort, there were accusations that the city was not fully disclosing the extent of problems with its infrastructure. And so the company, United Water, leaned on that excuse for some of the problems that were seen afterwards. But people saw their bills just go up, their service level go down. There were problems with leaky pipes or problems at the residential level that were, there was a months-long backlog in just basic maintenance. So, like I said, really from any lens, that was just a bad contractual relationship. So I think both sides were happy to walk away before that 20-year term expired. Yeah, sure. One more question, and I'll be happy to stick around for a couple minutes if people are willing to stay out the sun a little while longer. But yes, sir.
This is an observation. I think that from what I've heard of your presentation today, that in many ways North Carolina has been ahead of Georgia, well ahead of Georgia, in the various legislation that's been adopted over the last 25 years relating to water, for example, Interbasin Transfer, and so on. And what people really need to realize, which we know well in Asheville because of what has happened, is that with the current administration, many of those very far-sighted pieces of legislation are going to be removed, undermined, whatever. And so we're going to be moving back to face some of the problems that you've outlined that Georgia is having, that we have many problems,
Right.
as evidenced by Asheville, but I think in some ways we've been more far-sighted than you all.
Absolutely, I would 100% agree with that. I would certainly agree with that up until 2 or 3 years ago when we started to see the backward march that you guys are making, that we've been very dismayed with, and I'm hoping that will stop, especially when people start seeing the results like what happened on the Dan River. I'm not saying that this legislative evolution is directly correlated, but it certainly does relate to it. And so that's got to change, and hopefully it will. And all of our states are facing these challenges. I didn't talk at all about Alabama, but Alabama has no water management. They're just kind of, shrugging their shoulders a little bit. And the other issue is all of these states, including Western North Carolina, we have incredible biodiversity and these beautiful systems, and we have a real stewardship obligation to take care of those systems. And you know, we're the species that rely on healthy water are so vulnerable to these decisions that we're making. So we've got to get it right. And I'm hoping that that North Carolina will go back to its former philosophy of being very far-sighted, because y'all really did. Y'all were, you know, an example that we were holding up all over the country.
When Harville was bringing me up to speed on these issues, he mentioned that exact thing, that one of the sort of overarching concerns for water in the state and here in Western North Carolina is what he called kind of the rollback, the gutting of DENR, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. And he made the same point that Gil's making, that we can't say for sure that Dam River happened because it wasn't being watched, but it wasn't being watched. And it would have been watched a few years ago, and so that may well have played a role. So I think that's a very real issue, and as North Carolinians, we need to take that very much to heart, because we are not where we were 3 years ago, and we need to get back there and beyond.
Let's give a big hand to both of us. You remember, just a couple of things. Remember Kathy's Pigeon River case, North Carolina v. Tennessee? My brother Dyson and I grew up in Newport, Tennessee, on the lower Pigeon River. We walked to and from elementary school every day, across the Pigeon River twice a day. We had to hold our nose. Completely black, lemon meringue frosting. So we know that. The second piece is that really appreciate you coming out. Don't forget to fill out your evaluation form, and come back in 3 weeks for our third presentation, April 26th. Same time, 3 o'clock, same day, Saturday. We're going to have Hannah Holm. As the Appalachian Mountains are to the Rocky Mountains, so are our current water problems to Colorado's water problems. We're going to take a visit that day to ground central zero of water problems. You wouldn't think that the Colorado should have any water problems. Huge river. Well, they've got a city called Denver that's taking most of their water via big tunnels through underneath the Rocky Mountains. So Hannah Holm from the Colorado Mesa Water Center will be there. Leah Matthews, who's here, who is an economist. And I'll take 1 second to tell you my thoughts on economists. On Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, I think they're geniuses. On Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, I think they're morons. And on Sundays, I love their little hearts to death. So come back and hear both Leah and Hannah Holm. Take care.